All right, did we get everybody? Good. I think so. Well, to me, who has seen many of these groups come and go, what's interesting about this one is how casual it is. I mean, most people don't give a hoot in hell whether they listen to Terence McKenna or some other reasonable facsimile thereof, which is wonderful permission for me, so that it's not the close focus feeling I usually have. Because sometimes I think people attend these things who can do the rap better than I can. Let me just sort of make my way into it a little bit. It's like a faceted jewel or a dodecahedron or something. There are many different avenues into what we want to talk about. And it may be all avenues in and no actual arrival, because the object of intention is so elusive. One level is the search for spiritual depth and dimensionality in our personal lives, and how many people who got here by some conscious process, that conscious process was a process of either eliminating or augmenting other techniques in favor of psychedelic plants and psychedelic experience. And a lot of what we have to talk about is that in different contexts, like, for instance, the ding-on-seesh of the thing. What is it in and of itself? What did it mean for prehistory? What does it mean for the historical process? And what does it mean for us now, collectively and individually? And usually, as far as anyone is willing to go with this kind of thing, is to present it as a kind of self-directed psychotherapy of some sort that then leads to some resolution of conflict or self-acceptance or something like that. We'll talk about it in that context. But what it also has that fascinates me is a collective and historical dimension that is never really talked about. And then another facet of all of this is technology. That shamanism is a technological endeavor. And God knows the 20th century is the main vein of technological breakthrough. That has to mean that it also, in some sense, is a century of shamanic breakthrough. But the technologies of the 20th century at first appear to be either hostile or neutral toward the magical dimension. But we'll talk about computers and networks, and how at the level of social impact, these things have the same effect as psychedelic substances, because what they're doing is they're dissolving boundaries, they're globalizing information and democratizing space, and these are all qualities of hallucinogens as well. Another thing that we need to talk about is the content of the psychedelic experience. I mean, what exactly is it that makes it so compelling? Can it be Englished? Can it be downloaded into language? And then the question that has to be asked of any human endeavor or commitment, what is so great about it? And one of the questions that interests me is, like any cult, those of us sitting in this room who are heavily committed to psychedelics impute a kind of aura of moral superiority to those who take this path. Well, then the question is that true? You know, are we greatly different from a room full of Moonies or Scientologists or investment bankers? And if we are different, in what way? And is it a significant enough way to make all the shouting justifiable and worthwhile? And then finally, not finally, no one should be so rash, but what are the implications of the psychedelic experience for being? You know, I mean, we are, the only thing comparable to it is sexuality. But sexuality is built into our biology at a fundamental level. We can't shed it except through a fairly grotesque act of self-denial, which is to shed the act, but not the obsession. The obsession sticks with you unto the yawning grave. Psychedelics are somewhat different in that millions of people throughout history have gone from birth to the grave without ever coming near the psychedelic experience as it is known to those of us who've done 5 grams in silent darkness, and there are now millions. Well, what does that mean, then? That an experience that central ex post facto to the experience of humanism, of being human, can be avoided or not even cognized as a possibility. That bothers me. And I think history is a state of denial of this aspect of humanness. That, you know, yes, we have a self, an ego, a body identification, a social role, a personality, a genetic heritage, all these things we act out and trade in the marketplace of social karma. But we also have this other potential, which is to dissolve into a boundaryless place where language fails and where the objects of the imagination rise up with incredible existential presence. And clearly there's a lot of tension around this issue, similarly to the kind of tension that exists around the sexual issue, because much of human history is about what is called the spiritual quest or the spiritual path or esotericism or what have you. But in the presence of the psychedelic possibility, a lot of people in institutions get cold feet. And it seems almost as though this is a tool whose effectiveness exceeds the intent of the user. And the implications of that are very important. My intellectual history, somebody asked about my credentials. You can probably tell I'm not, how can I put it? Well, maybe I should say what I am. I'm basically a rationalist. I understand the rules of evidence. I understand what it means to make sense and not make sense. And here, close to the end of history, there's a lot of syncretic baffle garb ricocheting off the high walls of our cultural condition. I mean, somebody said, get a life. And I thought, no, get a past life. Later you can get a life. In California, what you need first is a past life. So that kind of thing. I have not found soft-headedness to be helpful in exploring the mystery of being. The real mystery can sustain real probing from an analytical, rational, and careful point of view. So in the presence of the mystery, the ordinary impulse, which is to adore it, I think has to be suppressed. Better to interrogate it. And if it's the real thing, it can sustain that interrogation. Any ideology or process that resists close inspection can be dismissed out of hand immediately. You know, I mean, the guy who does the card trick but won't let you look up his sleeves, that kind of thing. You don't have to worry about whether this is a worker of miracles or not, if you have any sense at all. So my approach to life from the time I was very young was to explore the peculiar, the edgy, the weird, magic, poetry, painting, eroticism, pyrotechnic chemistry, stuff like that. And some things satisfied and some things didn't. And as I grew older, I realized that what I was involved in was a process of debunking, deconstruction, elimination, and that I assumed that when I was finished, life would be as gray, dull, dreary, and pointless as it seemed to be for all the people around me. But somewhere in that process, I encountered psychedelic plants. And then it was as though the Ouroboros snake had taken its tail in its mouth. And I discovered there is at least one way back into the magic world of childhood. There is at least one trapdoor in the human mind that leads to fairyland. There is at least one mantra that, when used, dissolves the walls of ordinary reality and delivers you into the presence of the cosmic giggle. And I only need one. You know, it's not the path that I'm interested in. Having established that this could be done with LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, DMT, the limits of Ashtanga yoga no longer interested me. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Who cares? This does. And so I proceeded down that path, and I never had to abandon my analytical tendencies. I never had to abandon my rational mind. I never even had to abandon my slightly testy urban cynicism. And the thing kept moving ahead of me, working miracle after miracle. And out of that encounter, and the weekend will sort of spread this out and go through it, have come a number of ideas. Ideas about the importance of the psychedelic experience for us as individuals, ideas about how this may have been the very factor in the natural environment that was the trigger for the spark of consciousness to take hold in the higher primate brain and elaborate language and self-reflection and all the other abstract cognitive structures that distinguish human beings. It appears to be a doorway into a dimension that confounds cultural expectation. And what I mean by that is cultural expectation is that matter is supreme, imagination is a fiction in the mind, the dreams of childhood have to be put behind us. It argues that this is not true, that the process of acculturation into history, adulthood, society is in fact a kind of blunting of perception. Not an evolution toward a more sophisticated point of view, but a devolution into a more idiotic, simplistic, and narrower point of view than we bring in to the world. What the psychedelics argue is what we know to be true of every culture that existed before us in the past, which was they didn't know jack shit about reality. And the argument from psychedelics is that we don't either. That all these fancy incantations about quarks and mu mesons and all this is just malarkey. A lot of mumbo jumbo about fishy formulas understood by no one. You can't call that the worldview of a culture. That's preposterous. No culture in history in that case has betrayed its worldview into the keeping of so tiny a minority. I mean, we make the priesthood of the Maya look positively egalitarian. So, basically, the theme of my career and of this weekend is that in the inventorying of reality that Western civilization has been carrying on for the past 1,000 years, we have finally gotten to the last few items in the category labeled miscellaneous. And in that category, we find some mushrooms from Mexico, a particularly hideous small cactus, a few other anomalous natural objects. What this miscellaneous category is that eludes the understanding of science, anthropology, psychology, and so forth, is nothing less than the doorway swinging open onto the lost world of the human psyche that the historical process has been in the act of denying for 6,000 or 7,000 years. That materialism, abstract thought, complex hierarchical societies, these are all substitutes and sublimations for an inner state of existential validity that arose in prehistory through the human use of plants. Because remember, people possessed language, theater, drama, humor, art, storytelling for probably 250,000 years before anybody felt the need to crowd into cities, invent agriculture, take slaves, appoint specialized social roles, and begin ordering people around. So for 250,000 years, there was a human world not based on everything. And then this brings me to the last point that I want to make tonight, and these are just points to think on, and we'll go into it tomorrow. The 20th century is informed or suffused by a certain impulse, which I call the archaic revival. I wrote a book called this, and what I mean by that is that we are now within 6 years or so of the end of the 20th century, we are now, I think, in a position to say what it was about. And what it was about from relativity theory in 1906 right up to ambient techno music, body piercing, and tattooing in the early 90s, with everything in between: psychoanalysis, jazz, rock and roll, LSD, hippies, Nazis, all of that is about various impulses toward archaism, toward modes of behavior, styles of thinking, and approaches to each other that have been verboten in Western society since dynastic Egypt. And I identify this as part of a reflex in society that is unconscious. It's that when a society gets into trouble, its impulse is to think back through its history to the last sane moment it knew, and then to try and revivify that, to make a cultural revival. Now, a perfect example of this that everybody can understand is what happened in the Renaissance. Medieval Christian civilization was exhausted by the 1400s. There had been, 70 popes in 100 years, and not one of them had died a natural death. It was not a pretty picture. And nobody believed in Christian ethics or papal power, or there was just deep cynicism. It was a culture dying. And a group of Italian capitalists got together, and they financed archaeological expeditions and translation projects to bring back the literature of ancient Greece and Rome. Now recall that this literature had been in the ground by 1400, almost 2,000 years. Like, it was not, in other words, contempo for them, right? But they've translated all this classical literature, and they created classicism. The architecture, the law, the musical styles, the styles of poetics, of rhetoric. They created classicism and were able to keep the shell game of Western civilization going for a few hundred years more. Now, we face a much bigger challenge. We can now see that history has failed, that male dominance, materialism, reductionism, an obsession with matter, all of these things that we have been pursuing with a vengeance since 500 BC, the sum total of all of that is a polluted planet, an alienated body politic, and the circumstances we see around us. So this impulse throughout the 20th century has been building toward the archaic. As I said, Freud, Jung, jazz, abstract expressionism, house music, all of this stuff. But the central quintessence of this archaic impulse is shamanism, the bringing back of the first religion, the return of religion as it was practiced for the first million years of its existence. And when you slice up this figure of the shaman and the so-called shamanic complex, what you discover is it's about what Merciliade called techniques of ecstasy. In other words, techniques. Shamanism is not a belief system primarily. Shamans have belief systems, but their belief systems are not consistent across time and space. The techniques operationally do tend to be consistent. And what these techniques all are about is breaking down the ordinary constructs of social and community consciousness and replacing that with a disembodied, archetypically laden, generalized kind of field of consciousness that fills more than Newtonian space and that anchors the society, allows magic to be done, allows curing to happen, knits people together, causes the anxiety of facing death to be assuaged, so forth and so on. Well, I believe that individually and collectively, this is our challenge at the end of the 20th century, that history is like a psychedelic experience, and that we are now somewhere deep in hour two, about to go over the top. Wave after wave of invention, religious imagery, conversion, language, technology, obsession has come and gone in the past 5,000 or 6,000 years. Each wave ratcheting us further and further up the scale of intense involvement with our own cognitive processes and the downloading of those processes into matter in the form of technology. And the question is, where is it leading? History cannot be conceived of as continuing for thousands of years into the uncharted future. History isn't that kind of a process. History is some kind of chain reaction which quickly consumes all available resources and forces the system to mutate to a higher level of organization. And, with a cup of ayahuasca in one hand and keyboard access into the internet in the other hand, you can begin to see the dim outlines of what it is going to be. It's that we are hardwiring the collective mind of the species. We are undergoing some kind of metamorphosis. In the same way that a caterpillar changes into a butterfly, we are changing from a soft-bodied tribal monkey into an electrobiological coral reef that covers the planet from pole to pole. And we do not understand the dynamics of it. Life has never taken a forward step that it understood. Understanding is an act of reflection upon what has occurred. Each advance into the utterly novel is a leap into complete darkness. And with the introduction of the word novel, I come to the last concept that I want to mention tonight, and then we will elaborate it over the course of the weekend. I am, I guess, megalomaniacal enough to not be content to simply inform you of the facts of the matter vis-a-vis chemicals, plants, shamans, and so forth. I also want to flail you with my conclusions drawn from years of journeying into these places, because my concept of the psychedelic dimension is a largely mathematical one. In other words, a Freudian would say it's the realm of repressed sexual desires, and a Jungian would say it's the realm of archetypal striving and racial memory. My impression is that it is a mathematical dimension that is simply inclusive of three-dimensional space and time. That this is how the shamans do their magic. It's because from their point of view, it's not magic at all. It's no more magical than that I can look across the room and tell you Jim is wearing a striped shirt. That's not an act of magic, it's an act of perception. But if I were in hyperspace, I could tell you the color of your underwear or how much change would be in your pocket on noon next Wednesday. And these things appear to be miracles to those of us locked in three-dimensional space and time. In fact, they're simply trivial acts carried out in hyperspace. And shamanism has always been, I think, about looking at the end of the human sojourn in flesh and matter. And with the introduction of the word novelty, we come to a concept that I think is the great contribution that psychedelic thinking can make to the scientific modeling of the world. It is simply this, that the universe is an engine for the production and conservation of novelty. Every process builds on previously achieved levels of novelty. So that, for example, what I'm talking about is that in order to have molecules, you have to have atoms. If you have atoms and molecules, you can have cells. If you have cells, you can have complex organisms. If you have complex organisms, you can have human beings. Notice what is happening here. Each level of complexification utilizes the previously achieved level of novelty to carry the entire process to yet a higher level of self-expression. That's half of the insight. The other half is to notice that each advance into novelty happens more quickly than the stage that preceded it. So that, it took 1 billion years for life to leave the oceans. It took 600 million years for life, once it left the oceans, to produce creatures like you and me. Once creatures like you and me existed, it only took 500,000 years for them to go to the moon. Do you see? Each advance into novelty occurs more quickly. Well, this is, in our age, no mere abstraction. This is the fabric and feeling of our lives, because we can actually feel the temporal continuum accelerating. We can hear the roar of the cataracts at the end of time, because the culmination of this process of interdimensional involution doesn't lie billions or hundreds of millions of years in the future. It lies immediately ahead in the human future. And the reason I believe this is because I believe the fact of history happening on this planet is an indication that we have come to the short epochs of novel ingression. What I mean by that is, I got it down to a shoutable slogan: history is the shock wave of eschatology. What that means is, you have biology, sexuality, transfer of genes, rearing of young, life, death, birth. You have that. And then you have history as brain size and cognitive processes complexify beyond a certain level. But history only lasts for a moment. And beyond history, there is this collective higher dimensional thing, which is the source of our religious intuitions. I mean, we call it God or the Tao or the transcendental object at the end of time. It throws an enormous flickering shadow over ordinary space and time. It's like an attractor. And I believe the acceleration of time that is a commonplace of observation about our own century indicates that we are now below the event horizon of the basin of this kind of an attractor, and that we are being pulled faster and faster and faster into a confrontation with hidden dimensions of ourselves and reality, and that this will reach some kind of excruciating culmination in Newtonian space shortly after the turn of the century. And the proliferation of invention, connectivity, drugs, human beings, ideas are all indicative of this enormous outpouring of creativity that immediately precedes what I call, cribbing from Alfred North Whitehead, the concrescence. You see, the idea of ordinary historians is that history is pushed from behind, that it's the unfolding of a series of causally necessary steps that can be traced back to the beginning. I don't believe this. I think history is a process that is under the influence of an attractor. History is a set of narrowing options that are being steered into the future by the presence of an end point that the system is attempting to find its way toward. In other words, it's rather like releasing a marble up near the rim of a bowl. You know where the marble will end up. As it loses energy, it finds its way to the point of least energy, which is the bottom of the bowl. And the historical process is like this. And by historical, I mean the geology of the planet, which gave way to the biology of the planet, which gave way to the epigenetic sociology of our species, which gave way to high-tech electronic culture, which is clearly melting down into some kind of electronic, symbiotic, global morphology of some sort. Information is climbing a ladder through higher and higher levels of material organization until it can launch itself into a dimension that we, as the subunits of this process, can barely imagine. This is why we have art and religion and poetry, to anticipate the unspeakable. Well, that's probably enough anticipation of the unspeakable. One quick question. OQQ.
Do we have enough time or will to adjust our orientation as we make this approach? I mean, do we have to make a choice as we go around that spiral down into the hole of going foot first or head first? Or?
Well, it's sort of like death. You can choose to come to terms with it, or you cannot choose to come to terms with it, but postponement is highly unlikely in any case. Or, well, here, I just said it was like death. It's also like birth. Birth is also inevitable, but a good midwife can make the difference between a horrendous, painful, prolonged mess and a very smooth and community-affirming experience. So I think what we're saying here is I don't believe we can deflect what is about to happen to us. I think it was written into the script of this planet before the bust-up of Pangaea. But I do think we can guide, ameliorate, and give encouragement to each other as we go into this process. Sometimes people can't even tell whether I'm an optimist or a pessimist. And I realize when I analyze it, it's because the kind of change I'm talking about terrifies people. And yet I'm completely into it. I want to see everything changed. I really believe that there's solid ground on the other side of this leap into the utter abyss that history is going to force us to make. The purpose of psychedelics, I think, is to eliminate anxiety from social subunits called individuals, that if you do your tripping right, you'll cease to worry. That's the great panacea, not because it sedates you or deludes you, but because it hyperdimensionalizes you. And once it hyperdimensionalizes you, it's as easy to look at the future as it is for me to glance at my right hand. I mean, here is the future, here is the past. Oh, I see. So it works like that, and then it comes here, and then in order for this to make sense, this has to make sense, and then I understand. Got it. In other words, the great fear of 20th century secular philosophy, existentialism, that it is meaningless, that's now off the menu. It ain't meaningless. The trick is to figure out the meaning. But nature is not mute, as Sartre suggested that it was. Far from it. I mean, nature is the matrix out of which we come. Therefore, if we can understand it, we can understand ourselves. If we can understand ourselves, we can understand nature. Life is a puzzle. It's a koan in three-dimensional space. Nothing that you see is real in the sense that naive realists use that sense. Everything is a conundrum to be solved by an act of penetrating intelligence. The Buddhists call it discriminating wisdom, you know. And then if you can make that eidetic reduction, or however you want to style it, you are liberated from fear. Fear is inappropriate. Worry is preposterous. If your metaphysic doesn't tell you that worry is preposterous, you have the wrong metaphysic. And I'll try to convince you of that tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Thank you very much. Is long periods of meandering diatribe from me, and then question and answer about it. Unfortunately, we've discovered you interrupt the meandering diatribes at your peril, because even though you may be perceptive enough to see that it's horse shit, other people think it's music and they wonder what you're doing. I have no opinion on this. As far as I'm concerned, it's fine to interrupt, but the peril of your fellow seminarians has to be calculated. Okay. So before I do a meandering diatribe, are there questions or issues or anything anybody wants to drop into the pot right now? Yeah.
But I just need to know a definition or two. Hyperspace.
Hyperspace. Hyperspace is basically the part of the human experience that is not visibly beheld. In other words, the imagination, what we call the heart, the mind, the dream world, the imagination, the place the shamans go, the place the dead go, the place the babies come from. This is all hyperspace. And to contrast it, since there is a buzzword loose in the culture, cyberspace. Cyberspace is something else. Cyberspace is the reflection of hyperspace in a technological artifact. So in other words, cyberspace is the world of computers, databases, bulletin boards, virtual reality simulations, so forth and so on, which I take to be the patriarchal engineering mentality's response to hyperspace, an effort to make it literal, to hardwire it. You know, one way of looking at the dichotomy between shamanism and science is that they are masculine and feminine approaches to the same set of problems. Shamanism is body-centered, feminine, intuitive, and works with the wetware. And technological approaches are masculine, rational, material. But science essentially is attempting to do what magic has always done, and in some degrees with considerable success. I mean, for instance, the whole, human longevity. Science takes up the challenge of Taoist alchemy and does rather well with that. The transformation of all forms of matter into other forms of energy. This has actually been achieved in the 20th century. So there's a tension and a relationship between hyperspace and cyberspace. Hyperspace is the traditional unseen world of the human imagination, the world of folklore, elves, fairies, giants, so forth and so on. And cyberspace is the electronic mirror of our mind and collective culture that we're building under the inspiration and aegis of that older dimension. Somebody, yes?
You said comment on McLuhan at some time. What happened to McLuhan?
What happened to McLuhan?
In your diatribe.
Oh, I'll do it now. I was thinking about this last week. I consider myself a McLuhanite. McLuhan's great insight was that technologies, especially forms of media, shape human perception, not only at the societal level, but at the individual level. In other words, a culture which watches television is very different from a culture which illuminates manuscripts. He was talking about he was talking about media, print, radio, so forth and so on. Where I find his ideas useful is to then view altered states of consciousness induced by drugs and plants as extensions of the definition media. McLuhan's definition of media was it is an extension of man. Certainly drugs are this. And the bridge between these two domains is television, because television is a form of media and television is a drug of very addictive potential and society-shaping impact. It's hard for people to understand, like when you talk about television as a drug, some people say, once, I think it was in this room, someone said, but if it weren't for television, how would my children learn about nature? They let them in, yes. And so then, you have to explain to people, and this is not an easy concept apparently, that it isn't the content of television that's bad, the 30 murders a minute, the idiotic drivel about sex change operations and all that. It isn't the content that's bad, it's the media itself is bad. So it's not that National Geographic specials and Masterpiece Theater are better for you than Arsenio. It's that it's exactly the same thing, that the content is irrelevant. This was McLuhan's insight. This is what he meant when he said the medium is the message, And television works certain changes on people that are irrevocable. Blood pools in your rear end. You stare, your brain waves fall into a certain limited range, and you're on the nod. And just because there isn't a spike hanging out of your good right arm doesn't mean any dimension of moral righteousness is accessible to you when you look at other people who abuse states of mind. And the last thing I want to say about McLuhan, because it's the last thing I've thought in the privacy of my own mind, is people are always saying, why did McLuhan fade so quickly? It was thought to be this incredible breakthrough in the understanding of culture and media, and what the hell happened? The guy apparently had no disciples, and after a huge initial impact, it all disappeared. And I myself have been puzzled by this. And then it struck me last week as I was driving somewhere. McLuhan's message was anti-capitalistic. And that's what must have undone him. The establishment was not interested in hearing that television was heroin in any interpretation or from any point of view. And so he was just buried as a crank, an incomprehensible Canadian Catholic male white nitwit that nobody should bother with. But I think the insight was profound and can be taken further, because what is really happening, as I see it, in the culture wars now is that, McLuhan predicted a great clash between the television-based culture and the print-based culture. But in a sense, the compression of historical time made that phase of the culture war pass very, very quickly. And now what is happening is it's really a completely constipated, linear, mechanical, material, print-based money culture confronting a heavily tattooed, interactive, networked, psychedelic, polyamorous youth culture upon which it depends to keep its computers running and its databases clear. And so the exacerbation of these social differences and extremes is even more pronounced and accelerated than I think McLuhan would have expected at this point. One of the themes of this weekend that we'll return to again and again is that time is speeding up. This is not a metaphor. It's actually true. And it's partially the key to understanding the human experience, historically and personally, that it is no illusion that we seem to be circling some kind of metaphysical drain in the cosmos and are on the brink of some kind of transformation. I mean, that's actually true. It's a weird cultural illusion that we are able to look at our world and our circumstance and not understand that intuitively. I mean, there has been more change in the last 100 years than in the last 10,000 years. And there's been more change in the last 5 years than in the last 50. But no one draws the obvious conclusion, which is that change is going to accelerate to such excruciating speeds and intensities that you won't know whether you're Agnes or Angus before it's over with. Yes, over here.
I'm curious why you don't mention Noam Chomsky. It seems like he's, amongst other people, Michael Parenti, who continued the attack on the media. Of course, Chomsky's more of a political, how the media is used to, pass along that misinformation and to infantilize people and make the public incapable of critical thinking, and how the ruling elites are using the media as a tool for manipulation, and particularly the American public.
Yeah, well, I think he's doing a great thing. I guess the reason I don't mention him is I'm very wary of anyone I don't completely understand. And when I think of Chomsky, I think of transformational grammar. And I went to 10 lectures by him at Berkeley in the late 60s. And I was impressed, yes, but enlightened not quite, because I couldn't wrap my mind around what the rap was. He is doing great work. Gore Vidal is another person whose critique of American civilization is great. I guess I'm a little different from these guys because I've never sat down with Noam Chomsky, but I imagine that they are ultimately rational liberals, and believe that somehow political action will solve our problems. I have a slightly harder to understand position. I don't believe any mistakes have been made. I think history was a necessary phenomenon. The French have this expression, to step back before you leap. And I think history, all 10,000 years of it, was a gathering of our tools and a bracing of ourselves for what's about to happen. I also don't think governments understand or control the process. That the good news on this planet is that it's out of control. I mean, I never controlled it, you never controlled it. So when we say it's out of control, we mean that it's out of somebody else's control who really did dream of controlling it at one point and then lost control. I don't know who they are, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, somebody out there, the Communist Party, they certainly lost control. And this lack of control in the evolving process means that it is not being obstructed by human intent or political manipulation. Whatever is happening has a will of its own. I sort of script it all back into biology. I really think that history is a temporary and unusual circumstance that even though it lasts, let's say, 15,000 years, it should be thought of as a very thin membrane between two very different kinds of existence. The existence of technology-less people living in their myths and their songs and their stories and their shamanically created world, and the fusion of billions of human beings with their own technological excrescences in a planetary and transplanetary culture. And the transformation is instantaneous. In that amount of time in biology, a fly adds a spur on one hair of the two front legs. That's the speed at which biology moves. And in that period, we go from a primate population with a symbiotic relationship to cattle and mushrooms on the plains of Africa to some kind of instrument of the logos that hurls instruments outside the solar system, downloads all information into databases, reduces the Earth informationally to a point, so forth and so on. Something extraordinary is happening here. And we are called upon, as people living in this world, to understand it. And one of the things McLuhan said that I love is he said, we are moving into the future like people who drive an automobile using only the rear view mirror. That's how we're going into the future. We're being guided by Marxism, Christianity, rationalism, Jungian psychology. Yes, all these things. But my God, none of this is referent to what is ahead. And what we have to begin to do then is form a projection. Some computer people call it a simulation. Before that it was called a model. We have to begin to triangulate the future. We have never done that. We have never designed our human future. It's been allowed to happen willy-nilly and pell-mell and several other chaotic ways. 300 years ago, the concept of the future barely existed. I mean, if you read William Blake's poetry, he speaks of futurity. He talks about the vast heaving wastes of futurity. He means time to come. Well, now, this illusion of linear history is insupportable. The only people who believe in linear history are propagandists. Governments are now managing global civilization with one thought only in mind: to hold down panic. There are no new metaphors for how to guide a historical civilization into the future, because a historical civilization requires an exploitable frontier, cheap labor, and a market to sell its goods into. All of these things are disappearing for everyone because we are all on this planet attaining a sufficient level of market sophistication and technological sophistication that there is no colonial zone, no zone of cheap resources. I believe that all of these processes that we can observe and propagate briefly into the future to reach unimaginable consequences indicate that we are living in a new kind of time, that we are literally squeezing ourselves into another dimension. When you look at the human population curve, when you look at the human land use curve, it's clear that we've been hardwired for this kind of mass suicide for 25,000 years, around the clock. Every moment of every day of every month of every year, we've been marching resolutely toward total crisis. And now we're there. And the question is, why? What was this for? Are we just lemmings on a larger scale? I don't believe that. I notice that culture has an innate ability to present itself with problems and then to bootstrap itself to a new level and redefine the problems. And this is the challenge for us, I think. Everything that has been is fading away. History is actually ending. One can cry in your beer about it, but nothing lasts. I mean, this, I think, is the great truth that you take from psychedelics. Nothing lasts. I mean, Rome is dust. Most relationships, all relationships fade. Finally, ultimately, your own relationship to your dear self fades. Pantit rea, Heraclitus said. All flows, nothing lasts. And yet, Western civilization is a frantic denial of this. From the calendar to our organizations by which we rule ourselves, to our approach to medicine, to the promises of our religion, we seek that which endures. And the absence of it in the real universe makes us neurotic. And so there has to be a coming to terms with the flow and an embracing of it. It was interesting to me that when we went around the circle last night, so many people were body people, I guess because of the rollover from the massage workshop. The felt experience of being is the core fact of reality for each one of us. The experience of the mind in the body, in the moment. And you're born into that. And then, whether you're Hasidic Jew or Witoto or Chinese, your culture holds up a distorted mirror to that experience of in the body, the mind in the body, in the moment. And some different take is culturally downloaded into you. And this, I think, is what we have to recover. For instance, in our society, it's very hierarchical. Truth is handed down to us through Time Magazine, Scientific American, Physical Review letters, Mondo 2000. I mean, it depends on where you're getting your truth, but it's handed down. And so we are consumers of experience and authenticity. You know, to find out what's real, we read, we watch, and we listen. And yet, to find out what's real, you need to turn the perception inward and feel. The Western thing is a peculiarly now denying cultural style. You know, very, very much obsessed with the past, the lessons of the past, the direction of the past, and very much concerned with future gratifications that lie further and further outside the van of the moment. And the moment simply becomes this hairline transition from one to the other. Somebody once said of my great-grandfather, where he'd been was so-so, where he was hell, and where he was going was paradise. This is an Irish problem that can be generally extended to the human race, I think. Yeah.
How widespread do you think the community of people who appreciate psychedelics is? And do you think it's growing? And do you think there's some part of the world that's more receptive to it than others in the modern world, in the developed countries?
Well, as to how many people there are, it's very hard to say because we could be generous and say that everybody who's ever taken a psychedelic drug and everybody who's ever had a near-death experience and every woman who has given birth without anesthesia and so forth, that this is the huge pool of psychedelic people. Or we could take a less generous view and say that most people who've taken psychedelics have not really discovered what we're talking about. Almost utterly absent in the old world tropics, which have an equally complex climaxed flora, for instance, out in eastern Indonesia. So you might, and I do have great respect for the style of shamanism, psychedelic shamanism, that exists in Peru and Colombia, which is the shaman, the paye, the curandero, who makes plant preparations, takes them with his or her patients, voyages with them, and cures. Now, in the same way that we import exotic ethno-pharmacological activities into this country, the same thing has happened in Brazil. There are religions based on ayahuasca. But I am very suspicious of large groups of people taking drugs together, because I'm very aware that the way you control people with drugs, or period, is to give them small amounts of drugs along with large helpings of your message. And so I don't like dosing small doses, and I don't like theologies. One of the things I was thinking about last night after the talk was how I think several people, as we went around last night, said that they were into spiritual growth. And we always come to that place in here because I'm a great spokesman for psychedelics and have logged a considerable amount of time out there. And I consider myself utterly ordinary in the realm of spiritual growth. I'm not even sure that, strictly speaking, psychedelics have anything directly to do with that. I'm pretty old-fashioned when it comes to the concept of spiritual growth. Here's how you attain spiritual growth. Visit the sick and imprisoned, bury the dead, clothe the naked, feed the hungry. It has nothing to do with mantras, yantras, shastras, tantras, or any of that. It has to do with ethical behavior and moral feeling for one's fellow human being. And, if you've been visiting cancer wards recently, I admit you haven't seen me there carrying out bedpans. So it's a dilemma for me as well. Now, this psychedelic thing only indirectly feeds into that, because what it is it does carry you deeper into the experience of being a human being. And for whatever that's worth, that feeds back into the project of compassion. But I cannot imagine a spiritual hierarchy where we would determine the most enlightened among us by seeing who had taken the largest number of hits of LSD or psilocybin. I mean, that's silly. Yeah.
I didn't want to interrupt, but my hand went up anyway.
Well, you and Dr. Strangelove.
I'm faced with a little dilemma. It would be nice to have you continue with this fascinating discourse, or can we have that plus something where we can experience something of a shamanistic nature this side of the membrane that you spoke about earlier?
Well, if you mean, am I about to draw out a little glass pipe and send you into the howling maelstrom of the Mantelbrot Tao, we could do that, but only once. I said to somebody last night, after some of you left, after the official thing was over, we were talking about Salvia Divinorum, which is currently legal and which in fact would provide that experience. I think before I start turning people onto it in these workshops, I'll have to huddle with the Esalen management. But in terms of the laws of the civil state, it's now legal. And so there is, if any of you are therapists working with substances, who knows how long this door will remain open, but here is a perfectly legal avenue. And I've wondered what we should do about it. I've thought, I could bring Salvorine alpha, and we could turn someone on and carry them through it, and all watch one person go through it and then analyze it. But, it's fraught with the possibility of complications. Just because it's legal doesn't mean any of the real issues have been dealt with. I've also thought it could therefore be done on stage. You could do it as a performance. But again, I'm not sure we want to draw a lot of attention to this. Yeah.
The reason I ask that, I met someone in a hot tub this morning who was attending another workshop of a shamanistic nature, and he said it was experiential, involving music and dance and something related to that.
Yeah.
So this is what I had in mind.
Oh, okay. Let me address that then. Here we come to one of the great bifurcations in theories about what shamanism is about. And you can believe anything you want and have great experts that you can call to your side. Merciliade, who wrote Shamanism, the Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, which is the definitive text on shamanism as a worldwide phenomenon, took the view that use of plants was decadent, that the true shaman, whatever that means, attained the ecstasy through fasting, ordeals such as flagellation or hanging on hooks from pectoral muscles, or something like that. And that when a culture reaches the stage where, this is Iliad's words, it must resort to narcotic plants, then the shamanism is in a decadent phase. Well, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but if you are interested, you need to know who these people are. And Merciliade was a Romanian educated in France who cut his teeth on yoga in India, spent a lot of time in ashrams, and was brought up in that guru-based European tradition of spiritual ascendancy. Gordon Wasson, Weston Labar, and others who've looked at this have reached exactly the opposite conclusion. That shamanism without psychoactive plants is shamanism on its way to slowly turning into religion. And that techniques that recreate the trance through ordeal, through fasting or flagellation or piercing or excessive blood loss or acoustical driving through drumming or exhausting rituals of dancing, that these were shamanisms in transition into religion. Well, so here we have the greats of anthropology in direct contradiction on this. You can decide what position you want to take, and I would recommend that you go to the field and see what is happening. And I guarantee you, the cultures which are most like Paleolithic culture, in other words, nomadic, pre-agricultural, with very limited social hierarchy, without hereditary social hierarchy, so forth and so on, they are largely in the Amazon basin and largely psychedelically inspired in their shamanism. My approach to this is entirely pragmatic. If it works, use it. I've sat and listened and drummed, and it doesn't cut the mustard for me. I have talked to people, for instance, in the Harner movement, who were trainers in the Harner movement, and said, just between you and me, let's get our cards out on the table. Is this as good? And they say, no, it's not as good, but it's legal. And so what we have here are people making an accommodation to the state I think. Sometimes this is on the periphery of yet a related but different question. People always want to say, well, you're such an enthusiast for chemicals and plants. Can't this be achieved on the natch? Isn't this what yoga and meditation and so forth is all about? And my answer again is entirely practical. If you can achieve this on the natch through drumming, mantra, yantra, tantra, great. But most of us can't, and I can't. And what I'm interested in is a democratic doorway. I don't believe in spiritual hierarchies. I don't believe that some people can get to the gold and other people can't get to the gold. If it's gold, it has to be available to everyone. And these psychoactive plants are incredible. And they carry, this was a point I was making, this is why we call it meandering. They carry no ideological freight, no theology. When you achieve an altered state of consciousness under the tutelage of Swami so-and-so, an enormous exegetical body of interpretation is waiting to fall upon you. Well, it was a third chakra opening, and it had to do with the manifestation of Avalokiteshvara, and on and on and on. You know, when you take a psychedelic, no manual is provided, no interpretation. And so consequently, you get to build it up on your own. And I am, and this is again, I mean, I have to, as we get to know each other here ever so briefly, I will try to bear my biases so you're not misled. But I do not believe in experts. I do not believe that anybody should be honored as a superior intelligence. So tradition is to me rather interesting, but not overwhelming in its implications. The mushroom said to me once, it said, for one human being to seek enlightenment from another is like one grain of sand on the beach to seek enlightenment from another. In other words, what it's saying is, we're all in it the same. You know, you think Thich Nhat Hanh sees deeper into reality than you do? Of course not. How could that possibly be? It couldn't possibly be. So what the psychedelic does is it empowers you. And there is no ideological thrust coming with it. I mean, if you want to take some shamanic ideas and put them on your psychedelic experience, that's helpful. In other words, the worldwide shamanic tradition is that the universe is a series of levels, and that you sort of have to find the elevator, and then you can get off at different levels, and some are below where you are, and some are above where you are. But this is a map, not ideology. And I really think, and again, this is controversial, that entry into heaven is an act of intellectual apperception. It isn't the good who go to heaven, it's the clever. This is a perversely Irish notion. In other words, that reality is a puzzle, a conundrum, a koan. And if you don't get it, you're not going to move to a different plane. And getting it is an aha experience where emotion and understanding are fused. My attitude toward this question of can you get there on the natch is I in principle grant that it must be so, or we wouldn't have Saint Teresa of Avila and John Chrysostom and all that. But you know, these people were one every 100 or 200 years. I'm interested in every man, woman, and child being able to stroll through the fields of Elysium. And in that case, the plants represent the natural way. They are not unnatural. People who claim they can attain these states naturally, I suspect of serious mental aberration. Because if I could attain these states naturally, I would seek professional guidance. Because I'm not talking about a minor alteration of consciousness, a loving attitude and empathetic relationship. I'm talking about self-transforming elf machines smashing down your front door, taking you prisoner, rotating and balancing the wheels on your after-death vehicle, and then leaving the door by the bill by the telephone as they leave. I mean, you don't want this kind of stuff to happen on the natch, for crying out loud. You want to be able to fall back on the explanation that that's what psilocybin does, or that's what DMT does. And so it is, I think. And then you return to the God-given world called the mundane mind. And there we work it all out and live these truths. So it's not about how we want to get high forever or lose ourselves in some world of churning hallucination. It's that we want to explore and understand reality. I mean, what I'm interested in is the nature of being. And in the pursuit of that, I will read books in languages I barely understand, visit countries with bad water, undertake sexual experiences I wouldn't want to discuss with my mother, and take weird substances. But it's not that I'm into those things, it's that I'm trying to get to the pith essence of being. I see being in a body with a mind as an opportunity whose unlikelihood is beyond calculation. And yes, some people say, well, you live, die many, many times. Well, maybe, but what's the assurance on that? What if this is the only crack you ever get at it? Then you have to make good time. And so we're attempting to illuminate the surround of the circumstance of being. And we can do it through cultural values, through interpersonal values, or through this plunge into the depths of the self that Plotinus called the flight of the alone to the alone. And it's as much a part of who we are as our childhood, our sexual arrangements with people, and our anticipation of our demise. Life is not something to rush through and get over with. I think a lot of people's idea of what life is that you're trying to arrange your deathbed scene. It should take place in a large palatial home, preferably paid for, and you lie there in a vast bed, glowing relatives surrounding you, millions of dollars about to flow to them from your quiet and painless death there, surrounded by the works of art and the retainers and all. Well, this is squirrely thinking, this kind of thinking. I mean, even if you achieve it, you'll loathe all those people, and as you move your gaze from face to face, you'll see avaricious weasels waiting to plant you. So why not just get on with the business of life and live it? One thing, the way I think about this is, I've always been interested in the peculiar and the bizarre, and my mother spent thousands of hours, it seems like, to me, reading me the Oz books and that kind of thing. And I am interested in physical beauty of a certain sort. So very early on, I was like a rock hunter. And the concept for me at that level was you find these rocks which don't look like much, and you break them open. And then inside there is mineral iridescence, or 100-million-year-old clam shells, or stuff like this, that nature is full of secrets. And somehow, and I don't know why this is, as most people live their lives, they forget this, and they become more and more mundane. They become less and less themselves, and more a citizen, a mother, a lover, a son, a daughter. Roles displace being. And for some reason, and thanks God, this didn't really happen to me. And I just kept pushing, butterflies, erotica, philosophy, heresy, magic, and then drugs. And lo and behold, this is the path out of the mundane world. The world is not what they say it is. Everything they say is wrong. The world is labyrinthine beyond possibility of imagining, inhabited on many levels by alien intelligence, infinite in extent, staggering in its beauty, terrifying in its weirdness, endlessly satisfying and peculiar. And this is the secret. I mean, we used to call it the secret, because for us at a certain point it was accessed only through DMT. But all civilization, I don't care whether you're living in, Second Temple Jerusalem or Gothic France or modern New York, culture is a plot to hide this fact from you, to keep you from finding out this fact, that there are doorways out of ordinary reality into worlds impossible to describe and too strange to suppose. Imagine, too strange to suppose, meaning that no matter how bizarre your presuppositions, they fall short of the real nature of reality. And the cheerful model that we have created, that we are made of meat walking around on a planet subject to Newton's laws of motion, living from birth to death, is just hokum. Some kind of story told around the campfire by the gray-bearded men. Who knows what is really going on out there? And if you take control of your body and your relationship to nature in this way, then the effect, and this is, echoes down from the 60s where it wasn't really well understood, what is meant by tune in, turn off, after turning on, tune out. The tune out part means simply that culture takes a more appropriate place in your value scheme, i.e. it becomes much less important. What's really important is your friends, your neighborhood, your relationships, and then the leap to the total planet. But all of these structures put in between you and the planet, government, international finance, tax assessment, all of this is just malarkey and needs to be devalued. That's why I'm very ambivalent about political revivals, because I don't think we should empower these structures anymore. We don't want better leaders. We don't want leaders at all. That's the concept, I think. And we've got a lot of inherited structure from the momentum of the past that is going to have to be dismantled and cut up with the correct ideological cutting tools and recast in a new form. Anybody? Yeah.
I'm a little confused about two things that you seem to be saying simultaneously. One, that you're talking about psychedelics and personal freedom and enhancing personal power and removing these intermediate structures. But you also are talking about human beings sort of becoming cells in some sort of emerging mega entity, which is sort of, which sounds like it could very well be the sort of thing that makes a totalitarian state seem like, a bunch of libertarians, and that seems to be a bit of a bummer.
Yes. Well, the idea, I think, is to keep the human, the part of the human mind that wants to plan and control out of the picture. The thing that we're growing into in relationship to our technologies is biologically scripted. In other words, nobody will design it or control it. It's coming to be. Our freedom is somehow attained by withdrawing from this earlier structure that's been set up that is a structure of obligation and control inherited from the past culture. I think I'm as bewildered as anybody else in this room when it comes to trying to imagine what this future state is going to be about. I mean, I glimpse it occasionally. It seems like our whole world is defined by limitation. We can't even understand reality unless we can define its limits. And yet what we're moving into is a world without limits. I mean, sometime if you want, you should do the exercise of sit down, close your eyes, and imagine that anything is possible, and then design your lifestyle based on that premise. And you quickly see how there is a self-ascending series of images, the end result of which is very hard to predict. I mean, for example, if anything were possible, I guess I'd start out by living at Versailles. I mean, I would just say, give me Versailles and let me walk around in it and I'll think about this anything is possible problem and see if I like it. And then I suppose, at the center of Versailles say, could the last 14 months of Architectural Digest please appear, and I'll leaf through and pick something and go on. And then okay, now I'm there, I'm in the Architectural Digest place I chose, but now I begin to see that concepts like matter, space, glass, metal, these things themselves are confining, and I begin to build a house that cannot even be spoken of in English. And there are a self-transcending series of images. This is what I think history is turning into. That literally what is happening, I've spoken of it this way in the past, that we are turning ourselves inside out. The body is going to be recreated as an object freely commanded in the imagination. And the imagination is going to displace this stuff that we call Newtonian space-time, so that reality becomes the surface of your mind. You live in your imagination. This is clearly what the cultural enterprise is about. I mean, this is what human beings have been doing for a long, long time, by painting masks, by tattooing themselves, dancing around, telling stories, building buildings. All these are virtual realities. It's just that the virtuality of it is getting more and more realized and intense. And this is terrifying to us because we don't know the answer to a very important question, which is man good? We don't know. We have dark suspicions about this and high hopes, but releasing ourselves into a domain where we could become whatever we wanted is scary indeed, because we don't know. Will we evolve toward angelhood, or will we skew toward some kind of Giger-esque sadomasochistic nightmare and go the Auschwitz direction? I mean, there were people who had all kinds of power, and that's what they created as their ideal of a good world to live in. So what are the real outlines of the human soul? This is the terrifying challenge of the future, because we are overcoming the constraints of matter. We are overcoming the constraints of the laws of nature, and the soul of ourselves is being bared. And this is the cosmic drama. God laid an egg, and now we're going to see what comes out of it. And will it be a monstrosity, Il Dabuath, our worst fears concretized? Or will it be the peacock angel, the soul reborn, the alchemical distillation of the light being? It's freaky.
Do you think that the appreciation of psychedelics as a form of evolution is a growing idea? I mean, do you think that this is going to achieve critical mass, or is everything going to happen independent of that? It doesn't really matter.
Well, I don't know exactly how it will happen. What we call the psychedelic experience is simply expansion of consciousness. I see that let's say with the beginning of Impressionism in the 19th century, and then the rise of color lithography, television, the rise of the image, the way in which over the last 100 years the image has gained dominance through photography, film, video, color printing, all these processes, we are becoming much more psychedelic. If you were to go back 1,000 years to, let's say, the court of Charlemagne, you would quickly understand that the splendor of the court, the brocaded banners, the polished armor, the trappings of the horses and the knights and so forth, this is to impress. Because most people in the age of Charlemagne ate moldy bread, wore scratchy wool, and lived in sod houses melting away in the rain. So when they went to the court, they saw splendor, they saw spectacle, they saw a feast for the eyes. Well, that courtly aesthetic we have spread as a global idea. We all want to live like that. We all hang paintings in our homes and landscape and Persian rugs and all of this stuff. The psychedelic impulse, the impulse toward greater color, greater visual pleasure is pretty deep. I think, that since the 60s, the great legacy of all that is in fashion and design and architecture and city planning, because this is where all the freaks went. I mean, if you go to Silicon Valley, these companies are run, some of them, by suits. But when you go down to R&D, everybody has a ponytail, and everybody, smells of strange herbs and is slightly glassy-eyed. The straight culture is being programmed and run now by freaks. I think that the project of defining human freedom, which begins with, or it doesn't begin, it begins with ancient Greece, but the Magna Carta, the American Revolution, so forth and so on, is going to have to include the concept of self-experimentation with substances. We already have a primary document of the American Union that ensures life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, what can the pursuit of happiness possibly mean if not the right to use psychedelics? And the fact that drugs are destroying our society has nothing to do with psychedelics or drugs per se. It has to do with the fact that these very ordinary substances are sold at incredibly inflated prices and thus create an atmosphere of criminal syndicalism. Yeah.
You mentioned Auschwitz. There's a parallel since the 80s, I guess, and into the 90s of the horrible oppression of people who use drugs, illegal drugs in the country. Tim Leary said there's no bad dogs, there's no bad drugs. But certainly, you just made a distinction between hallucinogens and other drugs, and I think that's valid. But, in recognition of the great, huge, and growing contingent of people in this country who do use psychedelic drugs, and the benefits to be had, how do you stay out of trouble with societal authorities who are so scared that they create disproportionate punishments for people, send people to prison for years for possession of LSD, strip them of their societal privileges, take their property without trial? How do you use the substances and stay out of trouble with the authorities? Or can you expand my thinking in that? Perhaps I'm stuck.
Well, I think it's a worry. The simple answer is do not make money on it. That they don't care about drugs or your mental health or whether you jump out of a third-floor window or not. They don't give a hoot in hell. But they do not like money to be made without government revenues being honored from it. And so the way to stay out of trouble with drugs is don't get rich on them. You can grow legal psychedelics like Salvia divinorum. If you grow illegal psychedelics like mushrooms or peyote, and you grow only enough for yourself, it's very unlikely that you're going to get into trouble. I really think that this is the way to stay out of their sights. And then, you know, there is such a mass of sympathy in the country for psychedelics that I think things are slowly changing. I think it's a deeper issue than most people want to admit. For instance, there are a lot of people running around saying that cannabis should be legalized. I certainly think cannabis should be legalized, but I don't think it's a minor issue. And I think that's why it isn't legal, because the people who have made it illegal are perfectly aware that it will change the values of society beyond recognition if they ever let it loose. And that's the issue. How shall society look upon itself? We now allow the free manufacture, transport, and sale of the most dangerous drugs known to man, which are alcohol and tobacco. We have no problem with that. Now, why is that? It's because from the establishment's point of view, alcohol and tobacco do not promote revolutionary social values. They do not promote a critique of where society is going. Caffeine, we know that caffeine destroys livers, damages fetuses, so forth and so on. Every labor contract in the Western world ensures a worker's right to have a fix of caffeine twice a day. Well, now, why is this? It's because caffeine fits perfectly into the program of the industrial state. It supports those values. You get that last 2 hours of work out of people between 3:30 and 5:30 because you let them fuel up on caffeine and then go back to their keyboards. Psychedelics, on the other hand, by promoting intellectual evaluation, free thinking, discussion of alternative possibilities, are poised like a knife at the heart of every democracy, dictatorship, theocratic state, and council of elders on this planet, because it promotes questioning of values. What happened in the 1960s is very, very clear. That baby boom generation went to the universities and was the last generation to receive what has always been called a traditional liberal education. It means they read John Stuart Mill, Plato, Thomas Hobbes, Aquinas. They read all that stuff, the core works of Western civilization, and they took psychedelics and they began to ask questions. And it was at that point that the universities were turned into trade schools, and any pretense of educating the masses in this country was dropped, and it was decided, no, teach them data entry and give them 500 channels of TV, and let's try and hold on to the social engine here. No more John Stuart Mill and Thomas Hobbes for these people. They take it too seriously. Yeah.
When we talk about it, when you speak about the expansion of consciousness, my assumption is, and please correct me if that's not so, that we expand into the unconscious or subconscious. We don't expand somewhere out there. We expand into something that we already have in us, I suppose.
Well, these topological distinctions become sort of artificial. I mean, in us, out of us, no one knows where the mind is in the first place. I mean, no one knows whether it's in the wetware of the head, or it's no more in the wetware of the head than that a television studio is inside a TV set.
Let me then rephrase it. I didn't mean to make that limitation of it. We are going somewhere which is available to us, let's put it that way.
Right.
If that's the case, how did it get there? What is it that we're accessing when we're expanding our mind, our consciousness?
Oh, I see. Well, I touched on this a little bit last night. The meat body is embedded in three-dimensional space and time. And the mind, whatever its ontos for itself is, has evolved in the meat body basically as a data coordinating strategy for the purpose of detecting and responding to threat. So we are mapping the world in the nearby space and looking for threat. This is because the meat body dictates this as a primary concern, because we've learned the hard way that if something happens to the meat body, then there is a cessation of the ongoing experience of self. So there's concern there. But to make a chemical metaphor, sulfur, if you heat sulfur, it melts. If you continue heating it, it recrystallizes. If you continue heating it, it melts again. We say that sulfur has two forms that it can inhabit. And what's happening with the human mind is you can dissolve the boundaries of the body, and the mind will no longer then function as this reducing valve for the detection of nearby threat. It will just begin to let all the data in. And at that point, you have the experience of non-locality, non-dualism, atemporality. And because these are the values our religions have enshrined for us, we call it a hierophany, a mystical ascent, an expansion of consciousness. So what it really is it's a dissolving of the culturally imbibed linguistic and social structures and an expansion into what Wittgenstein called the unspeakable, meaning that which cannot be indicated by the tools of culture and language. The unspeakable surrounds us. It's all around us all the time, but language chooses not to see it. And so that's what's happening. And I mentioned last night, me and Stevenson, I mentioned last night that I make a mathematical model of it. In other words, when you dissolve the three-dimensional linear mind of Terence McKenna, good citizen, Newtonian, Democrat, and taxpayer, then what you get is this atemporal, shamanic, intuitive kind of state of mind that feels more human, because probably it's a state of mind that we resided in for 500,000 years or so before we put on the strictures and the corsets and the bustles of civilization and made ourselves grotesque parodies of what and who we had been. Know what I mean? I'm sure you do know what I mean. Anybody else? Yeah, over here.
Just one brief thing. Last night you mentioned that we were talking about the arts. You were talking about the arts and said that they've been around for more than 250,000 years. I lost the grasp of what you mean by arts in that context, given the fact that the species has functioned in a civilized, identifiable sense for the 10th of that time.
Well, I don't really recognize it as my opinion. Maybe you misunderstood me. It is true that Alexander Marshak and and those people claim there is a piece of bone with a set of lunar counts on it that's 135,000 years old. That's dizzying to me. I mean, it makes my hair stand on end to even think of it. 135,000 years ago, someone owned a bone upon which they made these lunar markings, and judging by the wear of the bone, it was in the possession of human beings for 1,500 years. In other words, it was passed from hand to hand. Until 22,000 years ago.
I must have misunderstood.
Yeah. One of the things that amazes me, that is sort of puts me in a different perspective than a lot of New Agers, is there is an impulse to fiddle with dates and to push everything into the past. So people want to tell you, oh, the Great Pyramid was built 60,000 years ago, or, you know, Atlantis fell 125,000 years ago. Well, I can't speak to Atlantis, thank you, but the Great Pyramid was finished in September of 2790 BC. And if you don't think so, you have a hell of a tough row to hoe, because the evidence is overwhelming. So to me, the miracle is how recent everything is. It's very, very recent. And because we only live 70 years, you can have, if you're not paying attention, the impression that things never change. But in fact, about 2,000 years ago, change just went berserk. And about 300 years ago, it went into overdrive. And about 25 years ago, it became asymptotic. Think about the world of 1894. I mean, the first airplane had barely flown. The first internal combustion engines were being put in place. There were no computers, no film. None. This was 100 years ago. Now, we exist in a virtual data space that has shrunk the Earth to a point. I can use Telenet and Mosaic to go on to the internet. I can inquire of a certain library in Tokyo whether a title is on the shelf. If the answer is no, I can move to Boston University's main computer with one keystroke. If the answer is still no, I can check the Sorbonne with one more keystroke. And this is how business is done. This isn't a spiritual activity. This is how the dreariest of human activities is carried on in the present mode. So, because the monkey body stays the same, because undressed, presumably, we look like people 300 years ago or 500 years ago, that's all that has stayed the same. And we spend a lot of time covering it up with ever-changing and very expensive fashions. So nothing that we behold stays the same. And this acceleration, to me, indicates that the psychedelic experience, as experienced by individuals, is a valid model for what's happening to the culture. I don't think we're going to build a new culture out of what's happening. I think we're going to dissolve the very concept of culture. Potentially, there could be as many cultures as there are people on this planet, because we are going to be so empowered to individuate. I have a thing on my computer that lets me program keywords into a database. Words like Mandaean, psilocybin, druse, grimoire, any words I want. Then, while I'm sleeping, my computer turns on and goes from one university database to another, sorting, seeking, looking for mail, looking for reports, looking for anything that mentions these things I'm interested in. And when I get up in the morning, the files are on the screen ready to be browsed through. Files taken from Yale and Manitoba and the State University of Argentina and so forth and so on. Any subject, it doesn't have to be the structural properties of ferroconcrete. It can be whatever you're interested in. And so we each, no matter how bizarre your interest, you can discover a community of people that are no further away than the guy in the apartment next door, that care about the things you care about, know more about them than you do, can help you find out about them, so forth and so on. No one need feel alone, no matter how bizarre their adaptation has become. So there's a curious empowerment of the individual through empowerment of the collectivity, but it's more and more biological. Government is an invention. This is not an invention, for crying out loud. This was issued at day one. And government may be a temporary thing. It may be possible to create a state of electrical unification and understanding where problems are simply solved. Government certainly doesn't solve problems, you know. We have many, many problems, the solutions to which are obvious, but the solutions can't be put in place because government is powerless to do so. Somebody else. Yeah.
Well, you said earlier, when yesterday after the lecture, some people were talking about spiritual growth and that, and you said that, you know, that's a different subject, you know, more along the line of what Mother Teresa does and that. But to me, it seems like your message has a very strong spiritual impact, even if you don't look at it that way. I mean, me looking at it from the outside. Is there
spiritual in what way?
Maybe I'm defining the term for myself much more broadly than it would be typically defined.
Well, I want people to relate to and feel the power of an unseen world. But I call it the imagination. I mean, I'm with Blake there. He called it the divine imagination. I think that the most interesting part of the human beings is the imagination. I mean, what is it? You know, and why do we have it? And clearly it's of a different order than what's going on among other species.
But isn't articulating the mystery as important of a spiritual function as tending to the sick?
Well, you're holding out a straw for me to grasp. Of course it is. Me and Mother Teresa. She tends the sick and I dish the rave. What I want to do is to inspire people to explore these places for their own self-education. The thing I like about doing what I do is, first of all, there's no ideology. You know, it's just an experience. The message here is get stoned. And there's no other message. Then there's my interpretation. But you may get stoned, and Revelation 1 may be that I don't know shit from Shinola. That would be fine. The important thing is to get in there. And partially just for your own good, because I believe people, this has always been there and people have always been doing it, but also it is where the future lies. It is what culture has always been about. What artists, poets, dreamers, religious maniacs, they've all been getting into these places. It's part of your birthright. It's part of your heritage. And for us to exist apart from it is to be very impoverished and hence neurotic. So it's like the ground of being. In my book, Food of the Gods, I actually made the argument, and I'll explain it briefly to you here because it affects our politics and our view of the feminine and so forth and so on. Because, you know, it's a big question. How did we get into this mess? You know, how could a simple canopy-dwelling monkey get into such deep shit as we have? What the hell happened? Well, so here's an idea based on looking at primate behavior. All primates have what are called dominance hierarchies. Male dominance hierarchies. What this means is that the hard-bodied, long-fanged, younger males control everybody else. The old, the sick, the young, the homosexual, the female. Everybody is controlled by these males. And this is true of all primates. Squirrel monkeys, lemurs, and it's true of us as we sit here. This is part of the problem of our politics, is we call ourselves civilized, but half of us get the shit end of the stick, at least half, hardly to speak of racial minorities, sexual minorities, children, and the elderly. So we're not really utilizing the full creative potential of our society because of these dominance hierarchies that appear to be biologically scripted into us. Just like a cat licks its paw, we as males dominate in the primate line. But psilocybin interferes with this. It destroys these dominance hierarchies. It creates a different social style. it causes monogamy to be traded in for let's call it generously, polyamorousness.
You said, use the word there a moment ago. What is this?
What? Psilocybin?
What's that?
What is it?
Yes.
It's the active principle in mushrooms, a psychoactive compound. And what it does in the diet, no, I'm not talking about now what it does if you give it to one of us, but what it did in the early human diet was it increased visual acuity. This has been studied. That means it increased hunting effectiveness. At slightly higher doses, it causes sexual arousal and promotes hanky-panky. And this is where the monogamous tendency to form pair bonding in monkeys would be overwhelmed. And if you trade in a style of monogamy for an orgiastic sexual style, an obvious consequence of that is that men lose the ability to trace lines of male paternity. And what that promotes is a very tight group bonding, because children are then our children, not my children, not me and so here, but our children, the children of the group. And then at still higher doses, beyond hunting skill, beyond sexual performance, but real high doses, the full-blown spectrum of psychedelic effects, the tremendum, the descent of the angel, the presence of the mystery, which we, for all our sophistication, are as entranced and astonished by as primitive human beings must have been. So what I'm suggesting is that there was a period in human evolution when, because psilocybin was part of the diet, the ordinary primate behavior of male dominance was dissolved, chemically suppressed, if you will, cured, if you will, through chemical intervention. And for perhaps 100,000, 200,000 years, an entirely different human social style evolved. Without dominance hierarchy, worshipping a great horned goddess associated with cattle, which were associated with the mushroom, nomadic, sharing sexual experiences in common, raising children in common, and under the pressure of higher doses of psilocybin, developing cognitive activity, including language. And this happy story would have maintained itself at equilibrium forever, perhaps, except that the African continent, where all this was going on, dried up, and the mushrooms faded. And after evolving language and a completely new social style, suddenly the thing which suppressed the male dominance hierarchy was no longer available. And it must have been similar to what we are experiencing. Life became brutal. People began, it didn't work anymore. And about this same time, human brain capacity expanded to the point where men could understand that a sexual act, however fleeting, would have consequences 9 months later in the form of a child. In other words, a cause and effect separated over time were intellectually coordinated at that point. And so the ownership of children by men became a factor. And this is the moment when agriculture was invented, when nomadism was abandoned, when slavery, urbanism, standing armies, specialized roles, suppression of women, kingship, all of the tools of Western sicko civilization come into being at that point. And I think, our dilemma is that we are creatures who were on our way toward angelhood in a symbiotic evolutionary relationship with a plant, and then the dynamics of the planet threw us an ugly surprise. And halfway to angelhood, we landed on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea with a bunch of goats and sheep and began hassling and haggling each other. And we've been at that to the present moment. Now, in this culminating cultural moment with global civilization and anthropologists running around to every nook and cranny on the planet, the news has been brought back to our civilization that there are people, we call them primitive, they're naked, they don't have a lot of electrical generation capacity, but they have these plants and they are living at peace with nature, at peace with each other, at peace with their children, in a situation of dynamic balance. So I'm saying that the fall into history is what happened to us when our dark side re-emerged in the absence of the sacramental psilocybin that had kept us in a different style for a very, very long time. And our neurosis, our discomfort, our lack of ease with the historical process is because we're uncomfortable with this. This is no fun. It was much nicer to all hump in a heap around the campfire, loaded to the gills, with our cattle penned up over here in the moonlight. Yeah.
Can you correlate, or is there a correlation with that fall to the Garden of Eden and the Christian myth?
Well, in my book, Food of the Gods, I talk about how that story is an echo of this circumstance that I'm talking about. If you read the story of Adam and Eve, you see, first of all, that it involves a struggle over whether a plant will or will not be used, and that the plant has a special relationship to the woman. This is the remembrance of the previous mother goddess religion. And then if you read it carefully, it says they ate of the fruit and their eyes were opened. There is stress on vision. Their eyes were opened and they saw that they were naked, which was in fact the truth. They were naked. So what they saw was their existential circumstance. And then a very puzzling and fascinating passage where Yahweh is walking in the garden, let's presume muttering to himself, because I can't imagine who he would have been talking to, but he says to himself, if they eat, if the man and the woman eat of the fruit of the tree of life, they will be as we are. They will be as we are. So the issue was not toxicology or addiction. The issue was knowledge. Who shall have it and who shall not? And it explicitly says there, if they were to eat of the fruit of the tree, they would become as gods. And this cannot be allowed. So the entire myth upon which Western civilization is based is a myth about how we were infantilized. The good stuff was kept from us. We're not ready for the good. And so we got kicked out of the garden because the woman wanted the good and tried to bring it to the man, and the landlord went berserk. And the echo of that story down through history is the footprint of this tension we have about drugs. This is why I maintain that we have this unique relationship to substances. You know, elephants will push down fences to get drunk on rotting papaya, and hummingbirds will get loaded off fermented sugar water. But no animal in nature exhibits the addictive behavior of human beings. This is one of the really strange things about us, is that we addict not only to many chemicals, but to all kinds of things, to behaviors, to religions, to each other, to places. Everything for us is potentially an object of addiction. Well, you know how, the armpit sucking cat phenomenon? This is because the kitty was removed from the tit too early, and for the rest of its life, this cat will suck on your clothes and try and get next to you, because it was weaned too early. This is what happened to us. The fact that our relationship to psilocybin was interrupted by the desertification of the African continent has left us with a yen for chemical stimulation that has caused us to try everything under the sun. And of course, in the course of that, we've discovered the morphine family, we've discovered tobacco, alcohol, but none of it brings the happiness that we're seeking, or it may bring happiness, but with terrible social and physical consequences. We can't seem to get it right, so we try everything: tobacco, alcohol, morphine, heroin, so forth and so on. What we are looking for is psilocybin. I remember a graffiti I saw once in the Colombian town of Cali on a wall. It said in Spanish, there was a little picture of a mushroom, and it said, "Without this, you are not yourself." And that is really the position I'm taking, that we were well on our way to evolving a symbiotic relationship with this plant, and the interruption of it stranded us in the world of language without soul. And stranded in the world of language without soul, we invented ideology, totalitarian religion, the Inquisition, Madonna, all these very, very dubious things. And now, anthropology brings the news that in certain rainforests and in certain remote uplands of the less explored parts of the world, human beings kept the faith. While we were out there inventing the differential calculus and all the rest of it, these people kept the faith. And it's still there. And it's still a mystery. It's as overwhelming and as mysterious as it was 20,000 summers ago on the plains of Africa. And once you discover this and verify for yourself what I say is true by doing it, history becomes for you an opera and a joke. And you see, now I understand. I understand who we are. I understand where we came from. I understand where we're going. And I understand how it is to be done. History was just a sojourn in matter during a period when we were unable to score. And now we can get back to the real business of being human, which is to have a lot of sex and a lot of fun and to take a lot of pleasure in your immediate environment and your friends and your children and your parents and your pets and your animals, and live in the moment and then philosophize around the campfire. That's the real life, and that's what we were put here to do. And I don't denigrate history or discount it. I think it had a purpose. I like the story in the New Testament of the prodigal son. Western civilization is the prodigal son. We made a hellish descent into matter. While everybody else stayed around the campfire having sex and getting loaded, we marched off into phonetic alphabets, tasteless overscale architecture, weird religions demanding sacrifice and so forth, standing armies, politics, racial hatred, and the evolution of incredible tools for the control of energy and information. And now, if we can take those tools back to the tribal campfire and say, what can we do with this? Not in the service of mechanized warfare, not in the service of investment-intensive capitalism, but in the service of human decency, in the service of each other. What can we do with these things? And I have no doubt, that we can create a paradise in the imagination and honor the earth, and that human aspirations and the integrity of the natural environment can exist side by side. What we have here, folks, is a serious consciousness debt, a serious inability to connect our actions with the consequence of those actions. We are unconscious. And if there is any truth whatsoever to the idea that psychedelics expand, augment, enhance consciousness, then there's a moral imperative almost to experiment with these things, because it's unconsciousness that permits racism, sexism, the toleration of homelessness, the toleration of warfare, toleration of torture, toleration of totalitarianism. Unconsciousness permits us to live in luxury while these things are going on. And there isn't a whole lot of time left, I think. I mean, I think we're going to be transformed whether we like it or not. But I think also each one of us individually is going to be somehow responsible for the position we take toward this transformation and the contribution that we make to it. I mean, it's a call to authenticity. It's a call to return to the central mystery of archaic life, which was this relationship to plants that called forth what we call humanness in the first place. Because it was during the period when we were taking psilocybin and being nomadic on the plains of Africa, it was in that period that we invented dance, philosophy, theater, language, caring for each other. Everything that we call humanness was invented under the stimulation of that prehistoric relationship to plants. And everything of which we should be ashamed, standing armies, social hierarchies, ideology, slavery, product fetishism, all that has been invented since the fall by hierarchical dominators who were dull as dog shit and loaded to the gills on bad beer. It's not a pretty picture. And we have to, like someone recovering from a traumatic childhood or something, we have to talk about what went down and air the issues and get straight about it. How many people live in historical amnesia? How many people know the real sequence of events of how we got here? If you met a person who couldn't tell you how they got here, you'd view them as fairly dysfunctional. But we regard a civilization that can't remember where it was 500 years ago as perfectly acceptable. It is not. It's highly dysfunctional. And I see the psychedelics as simply catalysts for the imagination. You know, a catalyst is something which drives a reaction faster than it would normally go. So I think we might have produced a civilization such as we have over millions of years had we not had the stimulation of psilocybin. But it's so synergized cognitive processes that in just a few tens of thousands of years, we've been able to go from essentially a complex animal to a planet-transforming force of some sort. And we need to participate in this process, and you participate in it simply by understanding it and honoring it and helping other people to understand and honor it. And the psychedelics, I believe, connect us up to something more important than history. They connect us up to the Gaian mind, to the biological totality of the planet, which is an interlocking set of homeostatic regulations that create and maintain equilibrium on the planet. It's the nurturing, what James Joyce called the mama matrix most mysterious. And that's what we've lost touch with, and it's made our historical journey very existential. And we now are in a position to recover that original insight and to use it to build a future for our children that is actually something we can be proud of. And it's been a long time since we could contemplate that kind of a future. Yeah.
Rianne Eisler has a book, The Chalice and the Blade, a number of years ago, about this harmonious, nurturing type of civilization, the goddesses and that kind of thing. Would psychedelics be an aspect of that?
Oh yes, she and I mean, she prefers not to speak to the psychedelic issue in public, but she and I have done weekends together. She describes the situation very well without attempting a causal explanation for it. I believe that the psychedelics in the early human diet are the missing link, that the explosive doubling of human brain size in 2.5 million years can only be explained through a very intense chemical pressure on the human genome. And the fact that it happened right at the time when we were developing an omnivorous diet as a consequence of changing our habitat from the canopy to the grassland indicates to me that there were probably a lot of indoles in that proto-human diet, and that is the key to understanding the incredibly rapid emergence of the neocortex. It's a great embarrassment to evolutionary theory, you see. Lumholtz, who's a very respected, straight evolutionary biologist, calls the evolution of the human brain the most dramatic expansion of a major organ of a higher animal in the entire fossil record. In the entire fossil record. Well, the reason this is an embarrassment for evolutionary theory is because this happens to be the organ which generated the theory of evolution. So if you can't account for that, you've got some serious rewiring to do. And obviously, to me, it was a chemical factor in the environment. And it must have been a dietary factor. Well, then you look at the grassland and say, well, what was present in the grassland that wasn't present in the canopy? And you discover two things. Large numbers of the family Gramineae, the grasses, which are recently evolved monocots and contain a lot of indoles in the sprouts and seeds, and in the dung of the evolving cattle in that environment, coprophytic mushrooms containing psilocybin. Psilocybin is it, and you see, it will change our view of drugs fantastically if we can establish in the common mind the notion that there wouldn't be human beings on this planet if it weren't for psychedelics. Psychedelics are not some alien, extraneous, recently invented, kinky thing. They are the oldest form of religion on this planet and the very force which raised us from advanced monkey to language-using, upright walking human being. Yeah.
If that evolution was chemically, if there was a chemical pressure, I would assume from evolutionary theory there would also have to be a usage pressure. In other words, you don't really develop an organ unless you have some use for it. So could it be thought now that really what happened was that everything that we now rediscover, so to speak, is in that part of the brain that we've always been told we don't use. We're using only 10% of our brain, we say, and things like that. Maybe it is all in there. Maybe it's been there, and we're just accessing it now as it got blocked off when we stopped using the chemical substances. And we don't need all this spooky stuff of interacting with each other on some cosmic plane. It's in there anyway.
Well, one of the things we'll probably talk about in the course of this weekend is that among these ayahuasca cults in Peru, what's going on is people sing very beautifully for each other's entertainment, but that the songs are beheld, not heard. You don't hear these songs, you look at them. And this suggests that the processing of information, which goes on for people like you and me in the ear part of the brain, might potentially be handled in the visual cortex, and that the phenomenon of language hovers in a kind of intermediate zone between acoustical and visual processing, because what we call eloquence or poetry or shamanic charisma is basically the ability to use language to make you see pictures rather than see words. That's what a great storyteller is someone who makes you see the story. And it is quite possible that psilocybin, which is related to serotonin, that there may be a synergy or a competition there, and that if you have psilocybin as a cultural inventory in your diet, the experience of communicating with other human beings is rather different from what we experience. It goes on much more in a realm of intuitive grokking of quasi-visual gestalts rather than a continuous stream of acoustical signals decoded out of a verbal dictionary. And, these are hard things to talk about because it's so subjective.
But I didn't mean only the peripheral part. I meant maybe there is really an 80 or 90% of our neocortex that contains a lot of stuff that we, for lack of another picture, call cosmic or call interconnectedness or call that. It could be that everything everybody knows is in there anyway, in every individual brain.
Well, this could be what we're calling the divine imagination. That, the libraries are there, the hologram is there, the Akashic record is there. Yeah.
Well, perhaps the psilocybin was a shortcut towards what we're evolving towards, the evolution of neurotransmitters, hormones that balance our homeostasis, and then what you were talking about earlier, in a greater group, we start to achieve homeostasis amongst ourselves.
Yeah, this is worth talking about. We don't have much time now, but the fact that the most interesting of these psychedelics, like DMT and psilocybin, are so closely related to neurotransmitters is very, very suggestive. These are alternate states of mind. You could almost say that what you're doing when you take a psychedelic is you're switching a 50-watt bulb and you're putting a 200 in the socket and then turning it on for 5 hours, looking around, and then it slowly changes back into a 25. These things are extraordinarily related to our own brain chemistry. Something like ayahuasca, based on DMT and harmaline, both of these things occur in the human brain naturally. Every single one of us has DMT and harmine in our brain as we sit here. So these things, far from being, chemically invasive or chemically exotic from the point of view of the brain's chemical system, no, they are structural near relatives, half cousins, and close friends to the things which are sustaining and maintaining ordinary processes of mentation. Why plants should have highly evolved mammalian neurotransmitters in them is a mystery still to be solved, but I'm sure there are answers that would stand your hair on end. Okay, let's knock off. It's noon. The reason we never have an afternoon session till 4, and that's so that you can enjoy the baths. If you're exploring the grounds, the other side of the river is freely available to you. Don't be intimidated by the bridge and all that. That's all Esalen. You can get to the sea on the other side by going down in front of the big house, and just enjoy the ambiance of the place, and we'll meet here at 4 for more games. Thank you. Let's see. Why don't we get started? It's kind of a dismal day out, so I imagine there aren't very many diversions elsewhere. The weather here is consistently better than in most places, but still you have to pay your dues at some point. So this morning it seemed to be sort of to open it up and touch on some of the broader issues or the context of all of this. We can go many different directions with it. We can go toward specifics of plants and technique, or specifics of ethnography or chemistry, or talking about the phenomenology of these states, in other words, to the best of our ability, what it's like to be there, and then to try and talk about it after putting yourself back together in this dimension. Tonight we will have the computer, and presuming that everything is compatible, we'll talk about the time wave tonight, which is just one. We try and hold all that stuff within the confines of one lecture, so that those who are gung-ho get their fill of it, and those who are ho-hum don't have to put up with too much of it. Let's see. Are there issues left over from this morning? Yes.
It sort of relates to this morning, but not quite maybe. How does it, what you're talking about, relate to psychic experience?
You mean in the sense of the paranormal, clairvoyance, and that sort of thing? Well, it's an interesting question, basically because it isn't really well answered. I think that even a reductionist would agree that if you want to study unusual qualities of the mind, you should perturb it and then study the results. I mean, this worked for the atom. You know, you didn't find out what it was till you smashed it. So it might work for the mind, or it may be so that you don't find out what it is till you get smashed. Shamanism is certainly about probing the edge of so-called paranormal abilities like precognition, miraculous curing, this sort of thing. And if you spend any time in the psychedelic subculture, you hear stories of miraculous cures and you know, on the edge of magic kinds of things. It goes on. It's very hard to statistically corral and to consistently replicate. But it seems that one of the things that we're getting close to with psychedelics is the realization that the universe is made out of language, that somehow the way in which these paranormal abilities work is that what we take to be the inviolate laws of physics are in fact just a fiction of a certain attitude, and that these things can be, under some circumstances, overcome. Experiments as simple as giving people psychedelics and then putting them through the ordinary battery of tests used to pursue paranormal abilities, like card guessing tests and stuff like that, have not really been done, amazingly enough. I mean, they've been done anecdotally, but they haven't been done in a rigorous scientific environment. So I think that one of the things holding back research into the paranormal is the illegality and the lack of support for psychedelic research. As I say, anecdotally, there are all kinds of stories. I could tell them to you all afternoon about strange and weird things that go on drugs, but the trick is to corral